go ahead, let's add it to the schedule. Looks like a busy week. All right, thank you. Today we begin a series exploring Jesus' example of holding fast to God's truths, even when it brings disapproval from others. Each of the Gospels contain stories of Jesus being criticized for a number of reasons, but we'll focus in this video on being criticized for violating Sabbath rules. Jesus' response was twofold. First, God's intent for the Sabbath was for it to benefit mankind, not burden them with restrictions. And second, Jesus is Lord of the Sabbath. Today we study God's plan for the Sabbath day, looking at the story of Jesus healing a woman on the Sabbath as is described in Luke chapter 13, verses 10 through 17. In Luke's detailed account of the ministry of Jesus, he includes at least 3 stories of Jesus healing on the Sabbath. In the 6th chapter of Luke, Jesus healed a man's shriveled hand, using it as a teaching moment. Which is lawful on the Sabbath, he asked rhetorically, to do good or to do evil, to save life or destroy it? That's Luke 6:9. In chapter 14, Luke describes Jesus healing a man with a body that was greatly swollen. Again, the Sabbath healing became a teaching moment, with Jesus asking, if an ox falls into a well on the Sabbath day, will you not immediately pull it out? That's Luke 14:5. Today's assigned text follows suit. On the Sabbath day, Jesus was teaching in a synagogue. One of those present was a woman who had been crippled by a spirit for 18 years, Luke 13:10 and 11. Jesus called her forward and announced that she was freed from her infirmity, and placed his hands upon the woman, and immediately she was healed and began praising God. That's Luke 13:13. The synagogue leader became indignant and promptly announced to the congregation, saying, there are 6 days for work, so come be healed on one of those days, not on the Sabbath. That's at Luke 13:14. Jesus answered, you hypocrites, doesn't each of you on the Sabbath untie your ox or donkey from the stall and lead it out to give it water? Then should not this woman, a daughter of Abraham, whom Satan has bound for 18 long years, be set free even on the Sabbath day? That's Luke 13, verses 15 and 16. So how shall we handle the Sabbath? Exodus chapter 20, verse 8 records the 4th commandment, which reads, remember the Sabbath day by keeping it holy. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but the 7th day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. On it you shall do no work. For 6 days the Lord made heaven and earth, the seas and all that is in them, but he rested on the 7th day. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and made it holy. That's Exodus 20, verses 8 through 11. Making a day holy simply means that it's set apart from the other days, to be treated differently. In this case, the Sabbath is designed for rest and for worship. Take a look at Exodus 20, verse 8, and Leviticus 26, verse 2. At the time of the creation, God established a period for physical and spiritual restoration. In Mark chapter 2, verse 27, Jesus explained, the Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. So the Son of Man, Jesus, is Lord even of the Sabbath. Jesus is Lord of the Sabbath because he was its creator. Take a look at John chapter 1, verses 2 and 3. And Jesus at the creation declared the 7th day to be a time for rest and restoration. Jesus, of course, understood the purpose of the Sabbath. He knew that the Sabbath is not intended to burden us. To the contrary, it's intended to be a time of refreshment and spiritual restoration. He was willing to endure criticism in order to declare the truth about the Sabbath. Today, the pendulum has swung to negate Sabbath by treating it as any other day of the week. We often fail to observe the Sabbath because, frankly, we're too busy. The world today tells us, treat the Sabbath like any other day, and Satan whispers, see, even Jesus worked on the Sabbath. But we need to be careful. Temptation beckons us to use the Sabbath as an extra work day. Busyness separates us from spending time with God for spiritual restoration. I recall, for example, years ago, a colleague at work announced that he was going to answer God's call by removing work as the primary priority in his life. He relied on God's assurance that when we seek God first, everything else falls into place. That's Matthew 6, verse 33. His decision, frankly, was ridiculed by some, yet he risked everything to follow God's priority scheme rather than that of mankind's. As it turned out, God blessed him. Just a few weeks ago, Chick-fil-A's restaurant located in the Super Bowl stadium resisted public pressure by remaining closed during the Sunday Super Bowl game. It sacrificed many thousands of dollars rather than forsaking God's standard for Sabbath. Mike, let's push that meeting back. Let's schedule it for Monday instead of running the risk of running into Sunday with it. Thank you. What are we willing to risk in order to follow God's true intentions for the Sabbath? How will we preserve a time for rest and spiritual restoration? Let's reflect on these questions for introspection. Question number one, what is it that gets in your way of observing the Sabbath? Are there particular temptations that defeat God's call for you to observe a time of rest and worship? Well, question number two, are you willing to ignore the pressures of the world in order to maintain the Sabbath as God has intended? What worldly sacrifices must you make in order to keep the Sabbath day holy? And question number three, what should your priorities be for the Sabbath day? That is, how will you observe Sabbath? Jesus used the healing of the crippled woman on the Sabbath day as a teaching moment. The Sabbath was made to benefit us, not to harm us. And Jesus should know, after all, He created the Sabbath. Yet we must guard against the temptation to treat the Sabbath as any other day. God set it aside. He made it holy so that you and I would be strengthened physically and spiritually every week of our life. Or phrased using the lingo of today, 7 days without a Sabbath makes 1 week, W-E-A-K. Are you willing to risk public ridicule in order to keep God's Sabbath holy? Preserve a time for rest and spiritual restoration, the day holy. And then question number three, what should your priorities be for the Sabbath day? Let's do that. What is the speed on that? Okay.